Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Colony Drop, a Gundam podcast where we talk about everything from the manga to the Gundam anime series and really any topic related to Gundam. My name is Isaac.
And my name is Brian. And today we are talking about one of the mainstays of Gundam, space colonies.
Space colonies, yeah. Brian, I think almost every Gundam series has a colony in it. There's only a few holdouts.
I think that's right for the most part. Even for the holdouts, I feel like there's still some presence of a space colony, whether it's mentioned maybe in the past or maybe like they did exist at one point. But you're right. I feel like you almost can't have a Gundam series without space colonies.
That's kind of what I really like about it because they're such a present part of Gundam. They're almost as ubiquitous within Gundam as like seeing like a mobile suit with a mono eye or seeing a Gundam itself. They're just so embedded into the setting of Gundam. It's pretty shocking when you notice a Gundam series doesn't have colonies.
Yeah. And why do you think that is, Isaac?
Okay. So Gundam came out in the 1970s. And this was during the height of the Cold War and the space race. Oh, the awesome space race. And I feel like there was a lot of talk about colonizing space at the time. You know, there is some now, but back then it was, oh boy, it was for the fate of the free world. against the commies taking over the solar system. And, a big discussion was how would humans move into space? And so a lot of scientists presented ideas for colonies. So the Gundam animators and story developers decided to fit colonies into the setting of Gundam.
And then in addition to that, the idea of a space colony, it creates conflict, which is what you need for a good story, right? So that conflict is between those people who live in the colonies and those people who don't live in the colonies. And presumably, because the colonies came second, someone on Earth is ruling over those people in the colonies. And obviously, at some point, that's going to upset someone.
That's true. Almost always the conflict in every Gundam series is between a colony, the colonies, and Earth.
Yeah, people really hate those ruling class.
Unless you're in a Mobile Fighter G Gundam, in which case it might be the other way around, right?
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that might be one of the only...
You'd love to get to one of those clean, nice, safe colonies off the polluted Earth. That might be where we're headed. Like that movie Elysium, right?
Could be. It's not going so well right now on Earth.
I wish I was on a colony right now.
So one thing I think that is relevant for really anything involving space colonies is what are called Lagrangian points or Lagrange points. And so we wanted to talk about these first because they're going to come up in pretty much every Gundam timeline that we talk about space colonies for. So a Lagrange point, it's a physics concept. They're points near two large bodies in orbit where a smaller object will maintain its position relative to the large orbiting bodies. So that is the Wikipedia definition. So I'm going to explain that in plain English now.
Say it in English, Doc.
So basically that's saying that colonies or colony clusters placed at the Lagrange points remain at those positions relative to the sun and the Earth, while the Earth orbits the sun and while the sun and our solar system, fly through the universe.
They're stable points of orbit, people, all right? They don't change.
Yes, there are 5 Lagrange points. If you picture the Earth orbiting the sun, there's one in front of the Earth, one behind the Earth, one to the left of the Earth, one to the right of the Earth, and then one directly opposite the Earth on the other side of the sun. And those same 5 points that exist between the sun and the Earth also exist between the Earth and the moon. So there's one Lagrange point behind the moon, in front of the moon, to the left of the moon, to the right of the moon, and on the opposite side of the Earth as the moon. So this works for any two orbiting bodies, in this case, either the sun and the Earth or the Earth and the moon. And in Gundam's case, it uses the Earth-Moon system Lagrange points.
You know what? For our listeners, imagine, ironically for Gundam, almost a peace symbol.
Yeah, kind of.
And where the lines intersect, those are more or less the Lagrange points, the L points.
Yep. And there's some pretty
irony.
Cool... Yeah, there's no peace happening.
We're living in a peace symbol. Yeah, we live in a peace symbol, but every 3 years there's a massive war.
There's so many wars. I don't really understand how there's any people left in Gundam.
Funny you should mention that. We might talk about a series where takes place after the wars.
Mm,
Ooh, more than
good
one
one.
series actually. Wow. Zing, but
There are some really cool diagrams, at least for the Universal Century, the main Gundam timeline, that show where the Lagrange points are, as well as what colonies are at what Lagrange points. If you watch a lot of the series, sometimes they'll say, "Oh, we're going to side 2 or side 6 or side 4," and if you open up the map once in a while, it's pretty interesting to be like, "Oh, that's where that happened." So kind of neat.
yeah. With the good thing too about the Gundam map, if you ever, I mean, come on, anyone listening to this, if you're a real fan, you should have seen this map by now. But anyways, let's say you pull up a map of like the Earth sphere. That map almost never changes. The Lagrange point, they don't move. That's the whole point of the point.
Yep.
That's the point of the point. So, the moon's going to be in the same spot. It's for whatever reason. They almost never change the names of the sides. Crossbone Vanguard got a little weird where they called it like Frontier Side or whatever, but it was still the Earth sphere.
There was one reorganization of the colonies in UC 84, I believe, but for the most part, once you have the map in your head, it gives some context as to where all this stuff is happening. It's not happening in like deep space. It's happening literally mostly around Earth, and that's kind of why people can travel somewhat quickly in Gundam.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not sure how this would even go. I'd be surprised if we saw a Gundam series that was like taking place across the breadth of the galaxy.
They might need some faster ships, maybe. If that.
Yeah. Then we have other problems because I don't know. Minovsky particles are stretching it enough. We reached the limits of believability. But
yeah. And then one last thing before we start, I wanted to mention is thinking about space colonies in general and thinking about, Gundam, which is a show that is about wars basically occurring at or around space colonies. Think about how terrifying that would be in person or in reality. If you're living in a space colony, you're essentially living in a metal tube. And
you're in a fishbowl, Brian.
Yeah, you're in a fish. It would be like flying around on Earth in an airplane, living in that airplane. If someone comes and blows a hole in your home, you are screwed.
I'm not sure. Well, that's a big debate too. Like, right? Like, all right, let's already jump into this. Brian, if you're in like a cylinder colony and someone like puts a crack in the glass, I mean, is the colony done for? Did the evacuation start? Or is it something they kind of expect and like a sort of patch team gets deployed?
Oh, I got it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can make those things without a plan for a breach. Yeah. I mean, breaches obviously happen a few times in the series, and I think every time they deploy people to go fix it, or they deploy that sticky stuff that plugs the hole, at least temporarily, which is probably the greatest invention. Yeah, the greatest invention, I guess, if you're living in a space colony. But just in general, the fragility of life in a space colony. They do a good job of playing that up in some of the series, but it could be even played up more, in my opinion.
I feel like depending on the size of, whatever hole happened to get put into your colony, you would notice nothing. You'd notice a breeze, or you'd eventually notice like gale force winds, and then you'd be lifted off your feet towards your death.
Yes, I guess you just don't want to be where that hole is.
No.
So should we discuss the types of colonies in Gundam based on order of release, maybe, or how would you like to do this?
I'm not sure. Actually, yeah, let's do that, because one type of colony is essentially the type of colony for Gundam, more or less, right? I mean, this type of colony has appeared in the vast majority of series, and it's pretty iconic. I don't think I've ever seen it in any other science fiction at all, now that I think about it. Yeah, wow.
Yeah, I mean, Gundam has sort of a monopoly on this colony, or at least
if
someone else used this colony, I'd be like, oh, look, it's a Gundam show.
Brian, why don't you tell our listeners what's the name of that colony?
So the Universal Century, the main Gundam timeline, uses what's called the O'Neill Island 3 colony cylinder, or just the O'Neill cylinder for short. This is a design created by an American physicist. His name was Gerard O'Neill, and his students actually helped come up with this as well, I believe. This was created in the 1970s.
I'm curious what his students did. Like,
So I,
they
my
threw on
understanding
the
is,
solar panels. They were like, all right, it's going to need energy.
well, my understanding is that him and his students actually worked out like all of the calculations to prove that okay, his design would be feasible. So they figured out, that it had to have two counter-rotating cylinders to provide approximately 1 g of gravity for people living on the inside. And they figured out how many times they would need to rotate the cylinders per day to get that level of gravity. They figured out how they would have to turn the mirrors to provide the right amount of energy and that kind of thing.
Right.
So, Mr. O'Neill here, he did quite a lot of work on this in the 70s. Clearly, it was a passion project of his. There were similar cylinder designs for colonies proposed a little bit earlier. There was a German scientist named Hermann Oberth. He proposed a cylinder in 1954. And then the famous British sci-fi writer Arthur C. Clarke, he wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey. He also used a cylindrical colony design in one of his works. But the one that we see most of the time in Gundam is the one designed by Gerard O'Neill. So the O'Neill cylinder.
As far as some technical information, the average size of an O'Neill cylinder is 6.4 kilometers in diameter with a length of 36 kilometers. So these things are pretty massive. I imagine an infantry battle inside one would be a very lengthy affair if both sides decided not to use mobile suits and needed to take the colony for whatever reason. By sheer manpower, it would not be a quick battle.
Correct, yes. I know Americans hate the metric system, so we'll convert it to miles for you, for everyone here. So that would be about 4 miles in diameter and 22 miles in length. And the circumference is about 12.5 miles. So I think that would put it, if I did that right, that would put, if you unfold the cylinder, right, and lay it out, I think that would be about 275 square miles in the colony. But getting a little bit more technical, each colony, the inside is composed, or the cylinder, I guess, is composed of 6 strips. And 3 of those strips are glass that allow light in. Mm-hmm. And 3 of them are sort of your land. And so there's 275 square miles of total area, but only half of it would be livable because the other half is glass. So you need your window, right, to let in the light. So it's pretty big, though, like you said. This isn't like the International Space Station. This is a large city. San Francisco is 49 square miles. It's 7 by 7. So if a colony is 275 square miles and half of that is livable, that's 137.5 square miles. And if San Francisco is 49 square miles, that is approximately 3 San Franciscos in each colony.
Man.
So there you go.
It's a lot of people in there, although not necessarily people, because the good thing about colonies is that they can be used for all numbers. Well, really anything. There's been military colonies. There's been colonies devoted only to beef, like Texas colony. But the vast majority of colonies are definitely, for civilians. They're just living spaces for the bulk of humanity. Something interesting I learned about the colonies, Brian, is that the mirrors, the 3 massive mirrors, they're not actually for power generation. They're actually for reflecting the sunlight. I didn't know that till I was doing some research. And the colonies themselves actually adjust the angle of the mirror throughout the year to mimic the seasons of the Earth. So say for summer, they'll be letting in way more light than opposed to winter, where they usually, scale back probably the temperature and the sunlight a bit.
That's right. But I believe they also close the mirrors to simulate nighttime as well, correct?
Wow. I wouldn't know. Hopefully not. I don't know. That might be really claustrophobic. I think I might like the night sky if I live in a colony. if they just locked me in, that might cause some problems with my mental health. I don't know. Speaking of locked in and mental health, there's actually more than one type of colony in the Universal Century. We have our O'Neill open types, which are the ones we just talked about. They have the glass. And over at side 3, Xeon, they got the closed type colonies, Brian, because side 3 is behind the moon and they don't get any sunlight.
I believe they built those closed type colonies because they were cheaper. and they could hold twice as many people.
That's very true. They did. And in addition to that, they're essentially, doubled their industrial capacity more or less because they have more people. So technically, Xeon might have been a double side. They had the strength and the resources of two sides more or less, which sort of explains why they were so successful to a degree.
Yeah, but it also explains why they were so depressed and overcrowded, because why they're called closed types is for those 3 strips of glass, you replace them with 3 strips of livable space. So that means there's double the amount of people in your colony, but no light, which means that your sky is going to be super gray and drab. And just knowing that you're living on the cheap colony, I don't know, can't do a lot for your morale. That's pretty depressing. I would want to revolt if I lived there as well.
That makes sense. Yeah. If I remember from when we see inside Side 3, there's like sort of a central column in the middle of the colony, and it's essentially a glorified fluorescent light.
Oh, so sad.
That combined with like the own internal atmosphere, just making a gray cloud along the middle. Yeah, it's a bit grim.
Yeah. And this type of colony, this closed type colony, is apparently closer to a design that was come up with by a guy named Henry Gray in 1971, which he called a vivarium, or maybe a vivarium. I'm not sure how Mr. Gray pronounces that, but so that one predates the O'Neill cylinder a little bit, but yeah, closed type. So that's why Xeon's, mad, because they live in a depressing type of colony.
Pretty much. But I will say this about the colonies in the Universal Century. They're pretty robust. How many times in the intro do we see a nuke going off inside of a colony, and like the colony just gets flooded with light, but the explosion barely leaks out of the colony? The colony isn't like shattered into 1,000 pieces.
I mean, I wonder if that would really happen.
I don't know. Yeah.
I do think if you blew up a nuke in a colony, I do think it should probably be destroyed. But I guess those Universal Century colonies, they're made of stern stuff.
Right. I mean, we don't know where Xeon put the nuke or what the yield was. For all we know, it was a pretty light yield.
Yeah, it could be a mini one. One thing I did notice that's interesting is that the O'Neill cylinder design is supposed to have sort of concentric counter-rotating cylinders. But in Gundam, the colonies only have one cylinder. So the Gundam O'Neill cylinders are not really necessarily scientifically accurate.
I think it depends like what series we're watching, because I remember in 0083, Nina specifically points out how important the pairing of colonies is, and she uses like these 2 glasses that she takes out and puts them on a table and like rotates them and makes them kind of touch, and that's when they realize, I think, that the colonies that the Lost Fleet has like hijacked or gonna collide and go out of control. But
I think that goes back to the Lagrange points.
Yeah, maybe.
Because so this is a good point to bring up. In the Universal Century, there are a lot of colonies, and those colonies are organized into what are called sides. So think of sides as just clusters of colonies, and those sides are what are at the Lagrange points. So you can have more than one thing at the Lagrange point and still have it be in a stable relative position. So I think what Nina was pointing out in 0083 is that maybe the colonies at that Lagrange point had probably moved because one of them had been moved out of the Lagrange point. So it affected the position of all the other colonies that were normally stable. They had probably moved a little bit because some of the mass had shifted away, and so it affected the gravitational forces on all the other colonies that remained at that Lagrange point.
I see. That makes sense, but I agree that depending on who's running the show and what's happening in the episode, they play kind of fast and loose with any scientific laws and theory. Sometimes we'll see a colony by itself. Sometimes we'll see its mirrors pointing away from the sun. Anything can happen. Maybe we'll even see it like perpendicular to the sun. It really doesn't matter for the purposes of the story, or at least very rarely will the science be required.
Yeah. I mean, it is a show about robots after all at the end of the day, so.
Exactly.
Close enough.
Brian, the O'Neill type colony appears in so many different series. We see it in Universal Century. We see it in correct century for a little bit, which for our listeners who might not be aware is in Turn A Gundam.
It's used in Gundam X or the after-war timeline.
Yeah, that's true. Oh God, that might be my favorite intro to a Gundam series ever, where they explain they explain that in this timeline, which might be the Universal Century, I don't know, the Earth sphere is in their 7th space war. So, man, things are bad. And the bad guys, or at least one of the factions, decides that in order to win the war, they drop almost all the colonies. I think they only save maybe 2 or at least a handful, but every other colony, just dozens of them get dropped on Earth. It's pretty awesome and horrifying at the same time.
Do you know how many people died as a result of those?
Oh boy. I don't know the population of Earth at the time, but it must have been untold billions.
It was 9 billion people perished.
Wow. Wait, what do you mean? Hang on. Do you mean just on Earth or including the population of the colonies?
I believe total.
Wow.
Only 98 million people remain after.
That is insane. You know what? I mean, we'll talk about this when we do our Gundam X episode. The determination or control that these villains had, where they dropped colonies filled with people onto Earth, because there's no way, Brian, that you can evacuate dozens of colonies and put their populations into like just 2 other colonies.
That's not going to work.
Yeah. Those people, I don't know if they died before they got to Earth or what happened, but my God.
They can't have all died.
The humanity.
That's true, man. Yeah. Yeah, that show is less about the colonies and more about the after effects of all of the colonies being dropped. Pretty horrible timeline to live in.
We also see O'Neill types in, very briefly, in Iron-Blooded Orphans. God, I think they're only there for like 2 episodes, maybe 1 episode.
Yeah, they were so briefly there that I don't even remember seeing them. But I mean, we did see the Dork colony, so I assume it was a picture of the Dork colony, I guess.
It was an O'Neill colony, and they were there so briefly, there was nothing out of the ordinary for it. So, let's see. Oh, Gundam AGE, they also use O'Neill cylinders.
That's right.
Yeah. And as the namesake of our podcast, let me just say that out of all the colonies dropped in every Gundam series, the leader, the first place goes to O'Neill type colonies for being the most commonly dropped colony in any Gundam series. They're just designed to throw, Brian.
Just nice little lawn darts you just lob at the Earth.
Exactly. It's a space javelin.
Yeah, space javelin.
Space javelin. Yeah.
O'Neill cylinders are also used in build fighters. The kingdom where Reggie is from is a O'Neill cylinder colony.
Nice.
It's not really elaborated on more than that, but it is just noteworthy that it is an O'Neill cylinder. So how many is that now? We have build fighters, Iron-Blooded Orphans, AGE, Universal Century, Gundam X, and they were also in Gundam Seed. Most of the colonies are not O'Neill cylinders, but there are some O'Neill cylinders.
Yeah, 1 Kira's colony,
as well as another one that we'll talk about later. But that most of the colonies in Gundam Seed are not O'Neill cylinders. But it's worth noting that is what, 7? Did I count that right? 7 series.
I think so. That sounds about right. Did 00 have O'Neills, or did it not?
No, 00 has what are called Bernal spheres.
Bernal spheres. That's why it was forgettable then, because we didn't spend much time there.
They didn't really show many colonies, yeah.
Well, Brian, let's talk about the sides in the Universal Century.
So as I mentioned, the colonies in the Universal Century are organized into clusters called sides. So I wanted to mention some interesting things about some of the sides that might help you if you're watching the Universal Century to keep in mind. Because I don't know that we really, they mention the sides by numbers in a lot of series, but they don't really give a whole lot of context. So you kind of have to do a little reading to kind of figure it out. Now, obviously, everyone knows that side 3 is Xeon, for example, but some of the other ones are kind of interesting. So side 1 is the Federation Space Capital. I can't say I knew that offhand.
No, and it must have been as meaningless in the course of the war as it is to us now.
Yeah. Side 2 is where Xeon took a colony to drop on Earth for Operation British, so that's pretty noteworthy. Side 2 is also where the Zanskare Empire comes from in Victory Gundam. That's obviously a lot later on. You see 149 to 153, but in the beginning you're dealing with Side 3, Little do you know, later on, Side 2 is going to be your problem.
Yeah, God, what did Side 2 go through that turned it into the Zanskar Empire? Arguably, by some fans, the epitome of evil in the Universal Century. But we'll get to that when we discuss the Zanskar Empire and V Gundam.
Side 3, again, Xeon. Xeon had a somewhat little bit happier ending. They did receive more colonies in the UC 80s to ease their overcrowding problem. But yeah, everyone already knows about Xeon. Side 4 is where Gundam Thunderbolt takes place. That's where the Thunderbolt sector is located. So that's basically like a sort of just messed up debris field, mobile suits, capital ships, colony pieces. Just not a very nice place to be.
Can I ask you a question about Thunderbolt, Brian? Sorry to get us off on a tangent.
Yep.
All right. If my understanding, the Thunderbolt area is, from what I read, is a vital supply lane to a Baoku, and that's the whole reason for the plot. My understanding of Gundam canon just makes my head spin at that logic. That makes no sense because a Baoku is like the doorstep of Side 3. There is no supply line. It's literally at like the front of the Xeon homeland. But anyways, I digress. That's all I wanted to say. Comment below if you agree with me or you disagree with me. Anyways, please.
I mean, I guess it could be because it used to be... Why not? Because it used to be at Lagrange point 5, and then it was moved to Lagrange point 1.
But Baoku is right by Side 3. There is no... Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see. You're saying relative to Baoku. Right. It could be that they have something at Side 4 that they don't have at Side 3.
Okay, I'll give them that. I'll say there's some vital supplies coming in, whether it's resources or food supply or something that they need for Baoku. All right. I'll back down.
Side 4 was also, as Isaac mentioned, rebuilt in Gundam F91 as the frontier side. Our friends at Side 5, that is where the Battle of Loom happened, which you can see in the Gundam The Origin TV show.
There must be nothing left.
Yeah, that one is also pretty much a shoal zone, as they call it, filled with debris, just like Side 4. But, Isaac, your pals at the Delaz fleet, they're from Side 5. So that's their headquarters.
Oh, you mean the Garden of Thorns? That's what they built in the ruins there? I see.
Yeah. Side 6, they also declared independence from the Earth Federation, just like Xeon. But instead of going to war, they played nice and kept up their diplomatic relations. And instead of getting attacked, they became neutral. And you can see Side 6 in 0080 War in the Pocket, that colony that the story takes place on, the Libot colony. That's why they're neutral, because they declared independence and they're just sort of not participating in the war. So,
let me say this: how neutral can you be if you're like hosting the research project for like the Federation's latest latest mobile suit?
Well, you've got a point there. Now, I don't know that the Libot colony knew that the Federation was doing that. Perhaps the Federation was doing it in secret. But you are probably onto something there. I mean, I believe that Side 6 did rejoin the Federation shortly after the 1 year war at some point. So maybe kind of realized that there wasn't a whole lot of point to being separate. Plus, the Federation could also just say, well, look what happened to Side 3. Are you sure you want to stay independent?
I don't know. I just feel like they tried playing both sides off, but they really ended up becoming like within an inch of being annihilated. That's
true. Yeah, they almost got nuked, right? They really would have tested your nuke theory about this.
Yeah, I'd love, on behalf of Xeon, I'd love to test this nuke theory. I'm going to put a nuke at every area I think it might be critical and see if I could actually one-shot a colony.
Send one right over to Libot. It'll take it.
We'll do it.
Side 7 is important because that's where the original Mobile Suit TV series begins. That's with the attempted Gundam Jack show.
Yay. Side 7 was furthest from everything else.
That is correct. Yep, Side 7 is located at Lagrange point 3, which is the one that is on the opposite side.
Yeah, so furthest from the battles, furthest from the eyes of Xeon, or so the Federation thought. But it turned out Xeon was willing to send a strike team over there and try to take out that Gundam.
And last but not least, Side 8. Side 8 was created as part of the G Savior story. So, you know what that means, Isaac?
I sure do. Actually, no, I don't. What does that mean, Brian?
It means it doesn't really exist.
You're right. It doesn't. And a little bit of trivia for all you G Savior fans. By that point in the Universal Century, they stopped calling them colonies, and they ended up calling them settlements by that point because they felt they really weren't colonies. They were full-fledged developed settlements, and that's just how the majority of humanity lived.
Yeah, I believe at that point also the Federation was losing control. So you can't really be a colony if your ruler sort of isn't ruling anymore, I suppose.
Even more G Savior trivia, Brian. By that point, the Federation was gone. It had been replaced by an organization called Consent, which stands for Congress of Settlement Nations, I believe.
Mm.
It's terrible.
Yeah. You know what? Nobody cares.
You know what? We're going to test that nuke theory on Consent without their consent. But
oh boy. I think that's all the sides. I do believe there are some colonies at some point around Jupiter. I don't think they're ever given a side designation, though, so I don't think there's a side 9 yet, anyway.
No, if they're by Jupiter, I'm going to guess they're in the control of the Jupiter Empire. So,
yeah.
You know, who knows what they look like. I assume it's a dystopian nightmare living there. I don't know. Fans probably don't know much about the Jupiter Empire, but they're the worst. All right. I think they'd like tattoo like a number on your forehead or something like that. Something crazy, if I remember correctly. Maybe I'm thinking wrong, but yeah, it's very much a dystopian society to live in.
I just imagine it's like a big floating head of Paptimus.
No. Man, I wonder what they think of him. Well, probably highly, or maybe low, because like he kind of failed.
Yeah, he did fail.
He did really well, but then he kind of failed. So
yeah.
So
the next series up after Universal Century, in terms of TV release, would be G Gundam or the Future Century. Ooh. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the quote colonies that exist in this show, Isaac?
Okay. I'm sure the fans know by now, and my friends know by now, especially Brian, that I'm not the biggest fan of G Savior. I think it's a little silly, and it was essentially, Street Fighter Gundam, because that was the hype at the time. It was the big trend. But the colonies in this are actually kind of awesome. I kind of like them in a way. They're very fun. I'll say this. They're very fun. The colonies are reflections of the countries that built them. Give you the quick rundown. In the setting of G Savior, the Earth is like a polluted wasteland. Whoa, oh boy. In the setting of G Gundam, I'm mixing up my G's.
How can I just say, how dare you mix up G Gundam with G Savior?
Comment below to give Isaac a virtual slap for blasphemy, for mixing up G Savior and G Gundam.
Multiple times, I might add.
Anyways, I digress. Let me recoup. In this setting, in G Gundam, the Earth had gone through, I think, a pretty bad world war, and it's also polluted. So the wealthy and the powerful built space colonies and saved themselves. They booked it. They left everybody else on Earth, and the colonies they built are reflections of their individual countries. Each colony is called Neo, and then the country it came from. So Neo Egypt, it has the pyramids on it and the Sphinx. It's very much a tribute to their history. Neo Japan is the Japanese home islands, but in space. And Neo America, it's like a star with like the Statue of Liberty on it, and I think Mount Rushmore, stuff like that. Each country really, took like their monuments and whatever makes them visually unique and just decided to design a colony around that and put it in a space. So I always thought they were pretty awesome. And they actually have like a bunch of secret weapons on it too that they use at the end of the series.
Some may paint their country in a better light than others. For example, Neo Mexico is a sombrero.
Yeah, I mean, I think they might not take themselves as seriously as like some countries take themselves, right? They're like, you know what, we're gonna have fun with our colony, and it's also it's actually a good astronomical shape, or for aerospace engineering purposes, it actually makes sense.
But it's such a permanent decision. Do you think people voted on the sombrero from Neo Mexico?
No, I doubt it. Well, no, there was no voting by this point. It was just, the wealthy and powerful or whatever was left of their governments decided, you know what, we have to go with something. I guess to an extent, it's like designing a flag, right? You have to think, okay, what visually can I create where people will look at our colony and know instantly what country we are? And then I'm sure somebody raised their hand and said a sombrero, and they're like, oh, okay, we'll go with that.
Fair. I mean, I guess I shouldn't expect too much from Neo Mexico. They did contribute Tequila Gundam to the Gundam fight, so right. I don't know.
Depending on if you're watching the dub or the sub, it's Tequila Gundam or Cactus Gundam.
Yeah.
Really like to not take ourselves too seriously down there in New Mexico. Here to have a good time and win lots of fights.
Yes. So needless to say, the G Gundam colonies are not based on any sort of scientific design whatsoever.
That's true. So, and let me say this about G Gundam. I don't think the concept of a colony drop is even discussed once, right?
No, why would you want to drop your sombrero?
I know. Well, I don't even think they think of dropping. Oh, spoiler alert! Oh boy, I don't even think they think of dropping like Neo Japan. When the situation starts going poorly, right? They're just kind of like, well, we're just gonna fight it out.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think they ever discussed the colony drop. But I mean, imagine if you dropped that Neo America. That thing would do some damage. It's got 5 points on that bad boy.
That's true, yeah. Although, I don't know. Who knows what it'll look like by the time it reaches the lower atmosphere. It could just be a blob of red-hot molten metal. Unless you Dublin it, Brian, in which case it'll land intact.
Oh, Dublin.
You can walk off it if you time it right.
All right, what's next up in the chronological release order?
It is Gundam Wing, which takes place in the After Colony timeline, Brian.
The show, like the Universal Century, uses a colony design that is based on an actual scientific design. The colonies in Gundam Wing are based on what's called the Stanford Island 2. And this is a design proposed by NASA in 1975. It's similar to the UC design in that the mirrors provide light and there's some rotation going on to provide gravity, but the shape is completely different. It's shaped like what's called a torus, which is basically a skinny donut. Is that a fair description of a torus, Isaac?
I would describe it as, imagine a bicycle wheel and the rubber part of the wheel internally inside that, say the opposite side of the actual grip. That's where the city is. So it's along that equator of the colony.
Yeah, you live in the donut.
Yeah, you live in the donut with your head pointed towards the donut hole.
Yeah. And there's a little hub in the middle with little like spokes that kind of connect the outer ring to the hub. And I think that's where ships dock and stuff like that.
I
couldn't find any actual size estimates for the ones in Gundam Wing, but the actual like proposed sizes by NASA are much smaller than the O'Neill cylinders. So the diameter here is only 1 mile ish, and the circumference is only 3.5 miles. So quite a bit smaller than the O'Neill cylinders. Now I don't know if it's supposed to be that small in Gundam Wing. Who knows? It could be much larger.
I'd say probably. I mean, if you remember the few scenes there are inside the colonies, it definitely comes off as more cramped, and to an extent, I guess the ceiling, so to speak, seems lower, even for the colonies that have tall buildings and skyscrapers. I can only speak for myself, but I am not a fan of these colonies. They're just too closed off. There's like almost no windows, really. They just seem very claustrophobic in a way, and sort of not slapped together, but I don't think any two colonies are the same. We see some that are sort of bicycle-like, where it's two toruses connected by like a very long connecting structure. We see some where it's multiple torus rings on top of each other. It just overall, I think, wasn't a very visually interesting design, which my belief is why we never saw it again. It is only in the Gundam Wing series. It's only in After Colony. It never shows up anywhere else.
Do I remember this right, that there's only really 5 colonies? There's one at each Lagrange point, and each of the Gundams in the show basically came from one of those colonies.
I think that's right, yeah.
So I believe they
Yeah.
call themselves, like, for example, Colony L1, and that basically just means the colony at Lagrange point 1.
Yeah. I always wonder if that meant an individual structure of a colony, or did that mean L1 would refer to like the collective group of the colonies there?
Yeah. I mean,
But
I took it as
yeah,
one colony, but yeah, it could be.
it was always kind of vague in Gundam Wing. They show a colony and you never really got a good sense of where exactly it was. And yeah.
But either way, just like Universal Century, those colonies located at those Lagrange points, because that's how physics works.
Yeah. From what I read, the original plan of Operation Meteor, which for all you Gundam Wing fans was the original plan to attack the Earth with the Gundams and liberate the colonies, was to kick things off by dropping colonies. I'm not sure how or where the population of these colonies would go, but that was their original plan that they didn't go ahead with, and thankfully not, because the Gundams themselves are powerful enough. They don't need help from anybody against those useless Leos.
The mighty Leo.
Yeah.
Talk about overkill. I mean, do you really need the Gundams after you drop all the colonies?
Apparently they thought so, to mop up whatever would be left after 5 colony drops. But you know what? Even that's optimistic, that thinking they could get away with 5 colony drops. If I remember, the Leos might not have been too powerful, but it's one thing to fight a Gundam. It's another thing to, have your forces in space blow away a colony. It sounds pretty doable, I think.
Yeah. So Gundam Wing, in summary, at least it used a different design to be original, but they were pretty ugly.
Yeah, it'll always be remembered for being a different design, but if you have to choose between living in an O'Neill open type or living in a torus, I'd be surprised if somebody picked a torus.
Agree. I would choose the O'Neill.
Yeah.
So next up is Gundam X, which we've already talked about. They use the familiar O'Neill cylinder. Should we just skip that one, I guess, and go right to Seed?
Yeah. So
Okay.
Seed is kind of unique in that it has, well, I think this might have been an attempt to dethrone the O'Neills with a new design. So in Gundam Seed, which takes place in the Cosmic Era, we see 2 types of colonies. The first type is our regular O'Neill colony. Our protagonist, Kira Yamato, he starts off at a normal colony, a normal O'Neill open type. But the other colony that is very frequently shown throughout the series is called a plant. It's a plant, Brian. You gotta water your plants.
Oh, Seed really loved like the whole plant pun.
Yeah.
Gundam Seed had plant colonies, and I believe they named them after like the calendar.
It wasn't even the regular calendar. It was like the Roman calendar. So they got
okay.
like names like Junius and Aprilius, things like that. But
in
general, Gundam Seed went acronym crazy. Remember they gave Gundam an acronym name? It was General Utility, I don't know, something else.
Yep.
Plant's a name too. Plant stands for Productive Location Ally on Nexus Technology, which sounds like the most scientific gibberish someone in marketing threw together to make an acronym for plant.
Yeah, that one seems really forced. That seems like some of the bills that come out of Congress.
As far as population of the colonies, it's bigger than I thought it was. A population in a plant can reach 2 million. That seems huge for, I guess, what it appears to be not too big of a structure. What do you think, Brian, about that?
2 million is pretty big, yeah. I guess I don't know how many colonies there are in Gundam Seed. I felt like Gundam Seed was really the only other series that had maybe as many colonies as Universal Century, or at least I felt like there were as many colonies in Gundam Seed as there were in Universal Century. So I don't know. I guess it depends on how many people are living in space. So for example, in Universal Century, at least 9 billion people at some point are living in space. If you only put 2 million in each colony, that means you have a lot of colonies.
Yeah, that's
so I'm
true.
not sure in Gundam Seed how many people are actually living in the colonies, but
well, I think Zaft had 12 plants, if I recall, and let's say each of those do max out at 12 million, so there's 24 million people. Essentially, all the other colonies were supposedly destroyed at the beginning of the first war between the Earth Alliance and Zaft. But yeah, it's the thing about the Cosmic Era and Gundam Seed is that it's almost very more than other series, except for maybe Gundam X, it's literally Earth versus space, Earth versus the colonies. There's no, one side colony that's kind of neutral, or, Luna's a little bit neutral. No, it's much more cut and dry. This is very black and white in terms of the factions involved. So I always thought that was kind of interesting, and I guess that kind of explained why they wanted the colonies to have such a different visual look and to be so bunched together.
Agree, that makes sense. This design to me seems the least feasible. Why don't you describe how a plant looks?
They're almost like very lean hourglass shapes, but instead of sort of having that kind of onion bulb in the middle that a lot of hourglasses have, these ones are just, straight diagonal lines towards the center. And the bottom parts, the round disc at the bottom, where at either end really, where the population actually lives, are just flat circles. That's where the 2 million will live. I assume 1 million on each side. Yeah.
So to me, this design, out of all the designs we see in Gundam for space colonies, seems the least feasible because it seems very fragile.
It definitely looks unstable. Yeah, it's supposed to be 30 kilometers long, which is pretty massive. It's technically long. Yeah, it's longer than an O'Neill colony. But yeah, these colonies just look not just unstable, but a complete waste of space and resources, really. I mean, for the size they are, they put their people on a pretty small area of it, wouldn't you say?
I agree. Yeah, it definitely seems oddly designed. And I just feel like, what if a mobile suit just flies by and nips that real thin part in the center? Do they just float away from each other, doomed?
It's funny you mentioned that, Brian, because if you watch Gundam Seed, every time the Alliance loads up their mobile armors with nukes and decides to make a run at the plants, they always aim right for the middle because they know that is the weakest part. And if they just fracture that in the slightest, if you watch the nukes go off, they don't even blow away that middle. They just kind of the nuke goes off and it just warps the middle. Just with the sheer heat, the whole colony gets destroyed.
Yeah, because then it changes the whole tension structure of the colony. It probably just rips itself in half.
These colonies just don't really need much to be destroyed.
It seems like a terrible design, if I'm being honest. If I was given the opportunity to live in the plant, the after colony torus, or the O'Neill cylinder, I'm still taking the O'Neill cylinder. I haven't seen an upgrade yet.
I don't blame you. I mean, say what you will about the O'Neill cylinder, but you can sort of look up in the sky and things are bad and you need to evacuate. You don't need to wait for somebody to tell you. You can tell when there's enemy ships around.
Yeah. This is just fragile little cones.
Yeah. I assume they put the science out the window because there doesn't seem to be any logic or rationale to them being so tightly clustered together. If you look at images of Zaft and of the plants, they look like they're, a few dozen kilometers away from each other. So and the Earth Alliance,
space is not far.
No, and the Earth Alliance uses that to their benefit because there's a few times where they're able to take out multiple colonies at once with a laser. They don't care.
Oh yeah, so fragile.
For the preservation of our blue and pure world, blue cosmos.
I mean, they look neat, but yeah, I think it's a bad functional design.
I don't blame the Earth Alliance for wanting to destroy those. They're an eyesore in space. I only have one more thing to say. In Gundam Seed Destiny, it opens with an attempted colony drop, or should I say half drop, of the ruins of one of those plant colonies. So kudos for being one of the Gundam series where they do a colony drop without an O'Neill type cylinder.
Oh, there you go. All right, the next series in TV release order after Seed was Gundam 00, aka the Anno Domini era. And from what I remember, nothing really good comes out of the colonies in this timeline. The Gundams are manufactured there. I think the government sends rebels there as a punishment. And they also develop super soldiers in the colonies in this show. I don't know, maybe there was more planned for the colonies in this series, but then those gray aliens came and, nothing else mattered after that.
Yeah, I don't remember the colonies figuring too heavily into it. It was very much a land war between the Gundams and the superpowers and trying to get them to sort of move towards becoming a one world government.
The one colony that we do see is based on what's called a Bernal sphere. That was proposed by Irish scientist John Desmond Bernal in 1929. And it's basically just kind of like a sphere filled with air that doesn't rotate or anything. The one in Double O has this sort of big solar power, I don't know, it kind of looks like a solar sail to me that's kind of just attached to it.
You know what? I'm not a fan of this colony. It doesn't look great. I can see why they didn't spend a whole lot of time there in the series.
Similar to the seed colonies, I do think this one looks a little fragile. Like, I feel like if you just went and cut off that solar sail, they'd kind of be screwed.
Yeah, I imagine a few glancing shots on the surface will doom the colony.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they don't fight that much around the colony, if I remember right. So maybe it's not a huge concern. But yeah, it didn't seem as robust. You know?
Yeah, Gundam 00 pretty much replaced the colony action with space elevator action. Like, that's where a lot of battles and a lot of important events happened. They always had to do with the space elevators and the solar arrays and all that.
Yeah, the space elevator, to their credit, was super cool.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome. Also, the only one we've seen in Gundam so far, to my knowledge. Well, actually, no, I take that back. Reconquista in G had was literally all about, I think, their space elevator. But we'll get to that when we get to that.
So I guess one overall thing I would like to say about space colonies is that besides the Bernal sphere, the other scientific designs that Gundam has used, you'll notice they were all, for the most part, proposed in the 1970s, which, as Isaac said, was the time of the space race and the Cold War kind of era. If you just think back to that time, can you tell that the 1970s were a great time to be alive if you loved space, or if you were a space fan? I mean, Gundam came out, Star Wars came out, Star Trek was still big. Like, real scientists were talking about colonizing space and coming up with these designs. So I would encourage people who are interested in these designs to just Google them, because there's a lot of cool artist renderings of these space colony designs from the 1970s, and they're really neat looking, and you can tell that passion went into these things. And I don't know, I don't feel like we have that anymore for space, and it's kind of a shame. I mean, maybe we're getting back to that a little bit with SpaceX and Space Force, I guess. I don't know, we'll see. Maybe I'm cautiously optimistic, but definitely check out those renderings if you can.
Yeah, to go off what Brian said, if you look at when these colonies were created and designed and the artist rendering, people were literally believing back then that we'd be at Jupiter by 2001, and all these projections that we had back in the day during the space race, we'd be farther along exploring the solar system and colonizing it, just because of how much money was going into the space race and because of the Cold War. So all that's gone away, for better or worse, and space travel now is just so corporate, really, with Blue Origin and SpaceX, like you said, Brian. But it's interesting. It's almost like a peek at what could have been in our world's history. But right now, this is as close as we can get to seeing the colonies more or less as scientifically accurate as possible.
So are you telling me that we could have had Gundams by now?
It's well within the realm of possibility, Brian. We just need to find a scientist named Dr. Minovsky, and everything else will fall into place.
He needs to find a magical particle and come up with a way to house it in a magical reactor.
God, the Minovsky particle does everything, doesn't it? It stops radar. It stops the only way you can look for someone is visually. It destroys beam weapons at long range, right? What doesn't it do? Yeah.
That's magic.
I think we covered everything in terms of colonies. Yeah.
Oh wow!
Everything
did you hear
but
that
the
one?
drops.
That was a big. That was a big explosion. Did you hear that?
Yeah. Boom. I think you're under attack. I think you need to.
Oh man, it's colony dropping.
Yeah. Comment below if you think Brian needs to get in his mobile suit, report to his team.
Oh, did you want to talk about colonies that you liked, Isaac?
You know what? As loyal as I am to Xeon, I don't like the closed type. I like the open type. The open type is way more iconic. I don't want to be in a Stanford torus at all. I don't even want to visit it. It looks terrible. How about you? Do you have a favorite type of colony? I don't want to be in a plant either.
Definitely the O'Neill cylinder. Again, I think if I was in a plant, I'd be worried that my home was going to detach from its other half at any given moment of the day. What if a strong solar wind blew by and just detached you? I'd be terrified.
Or be terrified the naturals would fly by any moment and throw a nuke at your window.
The Bernal sphere just seems a little boring to me. And yeah, the Stanford torus is just a bit ugly.
There you have it, folks. Comment below if you prefer a different type of colony. I have a feeling there's definitely going to be a few Gundam Wing fans that think the Stanford torus is the best colony in the world. So you can go there with Hiro Yui and have your romantic getaway.
They're gonna go Operation Meteor on you for attacking them.
Well, you know what? I got enough Xeon to support me and stop your little colony drop. We know all about colony drops here at Xeon. We don't just launch them. We know how to stop them.
They're the originator of the colony drop. So that wraps up our coverage of space colonies in the Gundam universe. Like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know what colonies you like, what colonies you don't like.
Tell us what country you're from, and if you were designing a colony in G Gundam, what your colony in space would look like.
That's a great idea. We should give away a prize for the one we like the best.
Sure. What should we give away?
I don't know. An extra model that I have laying around.
We can't tell you what scale it would be, but we know you'll get a model.
Something from Brian's closet.
And
that'll be a new feature of the podcast.
Random giveaways.
Yep.
The closet Gundam. Whatever's in there, you're going to get.
So, Isaac, this whole discussion about space colonies has had an ulterior motive, hasn't it?
It did. This was a plot, a secret Xeon plot.
What was the plot?
The plot was this whole discussion, this whole episode is actually going to lead into the next episode, which will be about dun dun dun.
Perhaps colony drops.